Good afternoon, friends. The translations of Marzieh and Gail are indispensable to contemporary Baha'i worship and scholarship. Some of her translations of the Baha'i scriptures, which brought them into the English-speaking world, are her translations of the Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys. The Seven Valleys have recently been retranslated, but hers was a long-standing translation. Secret of Divine Civilization, revealed by Abdu'l-Baha, and Memorials of the Faithful. Yet Gail, in addition to being a Baha'i scholar and translator, was also a scholar of 14th century Europe, specifically France and Italy in the 14th centuries, around the time of the crisis in the papacy, where there were 3 popes at once. I was curious about these two aspects of Gail's career. How can they be integrated? Yet we have one hand this outstanding Baha'i scholar, on the other hand, a scholar interested in medieval Europe. I wanted to investigate how do these two dimensions of Gail's career intersect? How does her Baha'i scholarship affect her medieval scholarship, and vice versa? Was her interest in 14th century Europe an avocation, a hobby? There's nothing wrong with Baha'is having hobbies, or having side interests in other fields. Yet I would like to suggest to you today that Gail's identity as Baha'i was central to her study of medieval Europe. In fact, in her 3 books on the era, Gail uses the Middle Ages as a laboratory, a testing ground, a proving ground for Baha'i ideas, offering object lessons and case studies of Baha'i concepts of history and time. Gail, in fact, wrote 3 books on the Middle Ages, Avignon and Flower, Life in the Renaissance, and the 3 Popes. And I'd like to pass around my copies of those 3 books today. Thank you so much. All 3 of these books are currently out of print, but it's been a challenge to find all 3. You're fantastic. I'm glad there's a copy here. Fantastic. That's really good to know that they're in the library. I appreciate that information. Thank you. Gail herself seemed to keep a line of distinction between her medieval scholarship and her Baha'i scholarship. In the blurb to Avignon and Flower, she simply says that she is a scholar with a grounding in Eastern history, investigating Western history. She did not mention in that blurb, possibly out of humility, that she did her research for Avignon and Flower during her 10 years in Europe as a pioneer in the 10-year crusade, or made little other mention of her work in the Baha'i field. That lack of integration between the 2 aspects of Gail's career also extends into her entry into Encyclopedia Iranica. Wendy Heller, in her entry on Gail, only mentions in 2 places, in short lines, that Gail was in fact a medieval scholar. Mentions she had 3 books about 14th century Europe, and a reviewer, noting that her work on the 3 popes showed her very unique and distinctive sense of humor. I'm very conscious that in this room are several people who have met Marzieh Gail in person. I hope this presentation does her justice. And if you have met Marzieh Gail, I'll be grateful for the opportunity to meet with you later on, perhaps this afternoon, to do some oral history. I'd love to hear your memories of what she was like in person. Apparently her sense of humor really stood out. So what could be some reasons why Gail would invest so much time in the study of the Middle Ages, especially at such a critical period in Baha'i history? There are 3 books of the Middle Ages written between 1966 and 1969, periods of great growth and mass teaching of the faith. Why would one of the Baha'i faith's most outstanding scholars, at such a crucial hour, give her attention to 14th century Europe? I think of a few suggestions why that might have been the case. What Gail is doing is what I propose to you is medievalism. Medievalism is a term coined by Louis Darcin, who describes it as the reception, interpretation, or recreation of the European Middle Ages in post-medieval cultures. In other words, The way we approach the Middle Ages tells us a lot more about the time we live in than about the medieval period itself. The Middle Ages are often used as a foil or a counterpoint to modernity, the opposite of the modern world against the other against which modernity defines itself, or as a place to experiment with ideas. So I'm proposing that Gail is using the Middle Ages in active medievalism as a place to demonstrate the efficacy of Bahá'í principles in another time period. So let's start with the first book, Avignon and Flower, and this is me reading Avignon and Flower in Avignon. I had the opportunity to visit Avignon, France, just this March, taking a student trip there. And I'm standing in front of the Palace of the Popes in Avignon, which she describes. This book is a sumptuous, beautiful book. It's worth reading for the poetry of the language alone, as well as for its gorgeous illustrations. This is a study of the period of Catholic Church history when the papacy was moved from Rome to Avignon, France. It was a period of great cultural creativity marked by new innovations, art and poetry, especially the poetry of Petrarch, the founder of the founder of Renaissance humanism as we know it. There was also a period of deep church corruption, such that Petrarch during this period, the Babylonian captivity. So in this book, Avignon and Flower, Gail follows the career of Petrarch as representative of his age. But beneath her study of Petrarch, her deeper argument seems to be to vindicate the contribution of Islam to the development of medieval Europe as a demonstration of the truth of progressive revelation. This book is sumptuous. It's illustrated by the artist Pauline Dames. If you recognize her style, she's also the illustrator of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. So this was a significant publication when it first came out. This is her map of the city of Avignon, with the Palace of the Popes right there on the center left. Gail's style is more, I call it experiential than academic. She does not write in dry prose. She tries to evoke the sense, the atmosphere, the feeling of being in a historical time period in a way that few other authors do. But in doing so, she sacrifices something of an academic style. Though she does cite her sources at the end of the book, she does not provide footnotes. So it's often she'll mention a very amusing anecdote from the Middle Ages, and it's hard to track down where she actually got it from. But I would like to suggest that some of her style in this book is redolent of Persian poetry. This is her description of the famous bridge at Avignon that the children's nursery rhyme and French song is named takes its name from. Let's give you a moment to read that. And there's the scene that she is describing. But all throughout Avignon and Flower, Gail consistently returns to Islam, showing how Islamic Andalusia spread its influence through southern Europe and Italy, especially in the poetry of Petrarch and the troubadours. I'll take one case example. She mentioned in her discussion of Robert the Wise, King of Sicily. She describes him as one of the many sources through which Mohammedan learning came through into Christendom. In fact, she argues that the very movement in this period against the corruption of the popes had its origins in Islam itself. Robert's very championing of poverty against the popes is Muslim. The poverty was a Mohammedan ideal that no one who has studied the life of the Prophet and of the Imam Ali will deny. Her study of the influence of Islam on southern France continues. She also credits Islam with the arrival of chivalry in Europe, arguing that chivalry or knightly conduct was brought back by the Crusaders from Islamic influence and played a role in the emancipation and recognition of the dignity of women. I'll give you a chance to read that, which includes a quote from the Quran, which says, "Paradise, he, Muhammad, secured rights for women which in our day had to be forced out of Western governments by embattled Christian feminists." Also, in her discussion of courtly love, a medieval tradition of reverence for women by knights, she describes Petrarch and his beloved Laura, to whom he dedicated hundreds of sonnets, and says that this reverence for divine women also comes from Islam. The Muslims who brought in chivalry elevated but did not deify Mary, who had been worshipped in Mecca before Muhammad's time. And she quotes Edward Gibbon that the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception itself, a long-running Catholic doctrine which was not codified into canon law until the 19th century, also has its origin in the Quran. And in Avian Good Flower, in one location, Gail actually quotes Baha'u'llah directly. In talking about elevated women in the Middle Ages, it says that she, Mary, is called by Baha'u'llah Persia that most beauteous countenance. So let's turn to Gail's second book, Life in the Renaissance, which is more of a systematic overview of the period, aimed mostly at young readers, but it rewards readers of any age. And what I noticed with this book is that Gail pays particular attention not only to the role of women and Islam's role in advancing the status of women, validating progressive revelation, but also on the marginalized and excluded in the Middle Ages. She writes about how people with disabilities, such as dwarfs, were mocked in the Middle Ages and not seen as fully human, trying to vindicate human dignity, which I would also say is a Bahá'í-inspired concept. Gail's also ahead of her time in defending and advocating for the inclusion of people of African descent in the European Middle Ages. There's a great movement right now from medievalist scholars of color arguing that Black people had a tremendous influence on the Middle Ages and are ubiquitous throughout medieval art, and in a way that's systematically been excluded through institutional racism from the academic story. In her discussion of a painting by Carpaccio from the Renaissance, she remarks that the most elegant of the boatmen is a handsome young Negro, wearing a tight-fitting red cap with a white plume. So she's deliberately focusing on the role of Black people in the Renaissance. Here's the painting she's referring to, and the Black man to which she alludes is in the center, piloting that gondola below, and here's the detail of him in the center of this detailed painting. In Life in the Renaissance, Gail also talks about the role of Islam in education, arguing that Spain was the country of learned women, again, due to the influence of Islamic Andalusia, and describes the Princess Marguerite of France as a little princess of 13, highly accomplished and well educated. They said of her that she was rather Persian than French. I love seeing the Middle Ages filtered through a Persian American lens. It's really rewarding to see. Let's turn to Gail's third book on the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, The Three Popes. This is an extended study of the Great Western Schism, the period in Catholic history when there were three competing claimants to the papacy in Rome, Avignon, and Pisa, and Catholics were divided to whom they should give their loyalty. In addition to the intrinsic interest of the subject, Gail seems to be as a subtle undercurrent of highlighting the importance of a covenant, the importance of successorship, and the dangers of disputed religious authority, which would have been a matter of concern for Baha'is in the 50s and 60s. For example, she draws out the theme of the independent investigation of truth, saying that many people just didn't care who the Pope was. They threw up their hands and said this was an argument for someone else. And she says, as people do in religious questions still, dismissing the whole subject, showing that individuals need to investigate religious truth for themselves. But in my favorite example from the Three Popes, she's discussing St. Catherine of Siena, a remarkable nun in the Middle Ages who wrote letters of advice and admonition to popes and kings, and who took a side in the papal controversy. But what I love is that he compares St. Catherine of Siena in her suffering to a Bobby. In describing the corruption of the clergy, she says the cardinals of her day made no sense to her, belonging as she did to the timeless, faithless band of those who immolate themselves. She could have been nailed up beside Jesus. She could have been a Persian Bobby, singing to the crowds who had come to watch him die. And inserts into the text of this academic study of the papacy this Persian poem. And I'm grateful if anyone's able to identify the source of the poet this is from. I don't. She's not include footnotes, so I'm not sure which Persian poet this derives from. This is the painting of the suffering St. Catherine of Siena by Tiepolo. So we discussed the role of progressive revelation and vindicating the contributions of Islam to the West in Marzieh's medieval scholarship. I also like to discuss how the Lesser Covenant, the importance of appointing a designated religious successor, so central to Bahá'í self-understanding of our administrative order, comes out in her medieval scholarship as well. So why is this question so vital, the role of Islam in medieval Europe? In emphasizing this, Gail was far ahead of her time. It's only in the 80s and 90s that Western scholars of the Renaissance have begun to acknowledge the centrality of Islam. But in doing so, she's taking her marching orders from Shoghi Effendi, who in a 1939 letter to an individual believer, quoted in Lights of Guidance number 1664, wrote that it's the task of the Baha'is to demonstrate the contributions of Islam to medieval Europe. And then to point out how these teachings have, through succeeding ages, influenced, nay, guided the course of human development. In other words, you have to show the position and significance of Islam in the history of civilization. And Gail, as a medieval scholar, certainly did take the Guardian's words to heart in this case. The Guardian continues, when medieval Europe was plunged into darkest barbarism, the Arabs were regenerated and transformed by the spirit released by the religion of Muhammad, were busily engaged in establishing a civilization, the like of which their contemporary Christians in Europe had never witnessed before. So Gail probably returned to this letter to an individual believer if she had access to it many times, that early on, many times, or if she didn't have access to that individual letter to a believer, to the general guidance of the Guardian, defending the role of Islam. Particularly, the Guardian writes, it is wholly unfair to attribute the efflorescence of European culture during the Renaissance period to the influence of Christianity. It was mainly the product of the forces released by the Mohammedan dispensation. So Gail's medieval scholarship was not a side interest, it was not a hobby, it was of a piece with her general work as a Baha'i toward defending the covenant and a Baha'i conception of history. Let's look at the Lesser Covenant in particular. Gail appears in her 3 books on the Middle Ages to implicitly contrast the clarity of successorship in the Lesser Covenant with the disputations around religious authority in the Catholic Church, when there were 3 competing simultaneous popes. The Great Western Schism provides an object lesson to Baha'is and to the world about the dangers of disputed religious successorship. She also seems to make a contrast between the corruption of the clergy during the Avignon papacy and the corrupt Shia clergy who persecuted the Babis and the Baha'is. There definitely is a critical of clerical vein running through the work. She quotes Petrarch that the cardinals were blinded by the piece of red cloth on their heads, or Dante putting popes and cardinals in his hell, including one of the Avignon popes, Clement V. But why is this such a focus for Gail in the late 60s? Shouldn't we have put all of our energy into mass teaching? There's a critical value to her work, though, because Gail would have been especially attuned to the risk of succession crises in that period. Just to summarize, you're well familiar that Shoghi Effendi the Guardian died in 1957 of the flu without an explicit will, though it has been argued that the dispensation of Baha'u'llah was in effect the will of the Guardian. And individuals appointed by Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi, the hands of the cause, govern the faith during the ministry of the custodians until the election of the first Universal Justice. However, lamentably, only one of the hands of the cause defected, Mason Remy, who claimed to be the next sole guardian of the faith and gathered a small following. He was ultimately unsuccessful and his following petered out, but it left a mark on the faith of realizing how dangerous it is for someone to dispute a legitimately appointed religious successor, whether the guardian or, by analogy, the Pope. I'd like to discuss the future directions I'd like to take this project. One area I'm interested in is trying to find out what Gail was reading during her 1932 MA in English at Berkeley, for which she earned a summa cum laude. I'm interested to know what medieval texts she was reading and whether those texts influenced retroactively her Baha'i translation work. Of course, the Seven Valleys is influenced by Sufic literature, but there's also a Western tradition of allegories of the spiritual ascent, such as the Romance of the Rose. Was Gail reading the Romance of the Rose or the Imitation of Christ or works such as that from medieval Europe, and did that influence her translations of the Seven Valleys? Was she studying medieval saints' lives when she translated Memorials of the Faithful, and so on? I'm also interested in whether her translation work shows evidence of medievalism. There is some evidence of medievalism in her translation of The Secret of Divine Civilization, where she highlights the passage where Abdul Baha discusses how Pope Sylvester studied under Muslim scholars in Spain, and also the role of Martin Luther in combating corruption in the church. So today I hope to have persuaded you that Martha Gail's medieval scholarship was not a side hobby. It was central and vital to her argument for the importance of the covenant and the importance of progressive revelation. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. That's fantastic. So now we have time for questions and comments for both speakers. Please.
So I have a question for Dr. Namar regarding a reference to Prime Minister Mossadegh and the Shiraz. That's an important point, if possible. Please give us some explanation. And a question for Mr. Russell. Interestingly,